Because the history of the United States is arranged around what we call a construct of race, race is a construct, it is not real. Community change can't happen unless we would make change or understand how racism acts as a barrier to self-sufficiency and to self-development. So this forum is going to operate on certain premises, and that's because racism has been consciously and systematically erected in our society. We're not going to reduce the idea of other kinds of oppressions. They exist, and we know that. But we're going to talk about racism primarily and economics in the United States. We're not going to talk about those oppressions that we know occur all over the world. We're going to be here at home dealing with our at-home issues. We often hear of how multicultural our society is, especially here in Cumberland County. We have many, many different kinds of people, many people from different parts of the world. While many cultures may be represented in a society, multiculturalism in itself, in and of itself, does not, may not, and does not represent an important piece, and that's co-equality. So we're going to be dealing with that today. There are great differences in values of equality. Many are built on culture, but especially they are built around race. If we were in a pluralistic society where there is representation of so many different races and different groups, the society is pluralistic only when all are seen and treated as equals. So most people describe racism in certain ways, and one of three ways. So we have the one way is individual or personal racism. And individual or personal racism, as it says, is a belief based on a premise of a hierarchy of races. Two characteristics are internalized superiority by one group and internalized inferiority by another. Cultural racism, that encompasses the collective identity of a group. There's an assumption that the values and the standards and the cultural habits of one group are the norm, and everyone is measured against that norm. It's when one group uses power to perpetuate their cultural heritage and imposes it on others, while at the same time destroying or appropriating the cultures of others. And we're going to be addressing that issue of appropriation of other people's cultures while not giving up power. So we have young white boys who wear their pants down in what they consider ghetto style. But when it's time to finish college and go on to jobs, there is no sharing of power. They put on a suit and a tie and enter into the hierarchy, into areas of power. Cultural racism often supports and sustains both personal and institutional racism. Institutional racism. That is a systemic use of power by a dominant racial group at the expense of non-dominant groups. Institutions representing institutional racism have great power to reward and to penalize. And we'll be addressing the issues of rewards and penalization. And our focus today is on institutional racism, primarily. If we started on personal racism or personal issues and things that have happened, we would spend days and days talking about the insults and the pain and so on. What we want to do is look at the institutions that are in place. While we can examine forms of individual cultures as well as institutions, the goal is to move us on a continuum toward becoming an anti-racist, multicultural community. So we have some core concepts we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about race. First of all, it is a scientifically discredited term formerly used to describe biologically distinct groups of persons. The term race is a way of categorizing people generally based on phenotype or differences of facial characteristics, skin color, or hair type. Phenotype, or the way one looks, may not correlate to genetic makeup. You cannot look at anyone and really determine what they are. You can only do that genetically. Sometimes we do it. We say, oh, that person's an Indian, or that one is you can't really do that because people can look many different ways. And many people in this society look as though they may be people of color, but they are mixed. I dare say everybody in this room is mixed with some other so-called race, whether they look like it or not, from the blondest hair, blue-eyed person to the person with the darkest skin and most super curly hair. I would almost guarantee you in the United States of America they are triracial at some level. Now, racism is the unequal treatment of a population group purely because of its possession of physical or other characteristics socially defined as denoting a particular race. For our purposes, we define it as prejudice plus power. It is racial prejudice plus the power to sustain that prejudice, the constructed power to maintain the privileges of one ethnic racial group over another. That is what racism is. So I may be biased. I may not like the way Roger looks, you know, but I have no power to control the outcomes or sustain that control over his life or the lives of people here, but institutions do. So we want to keep that in mind. If we get into personal, we'd be all day. But let's look at those institutions. They're big and they're hard to look at because they're invisible for the most part. But you know as well as I do that they're there and they're in place. All right, let's talk about power. What is power? The ability to control cultural, material, and human resources. The ability to institutionalize a system of rewards and punishments based on the way in which social goods and services are distributed. Very important. Having access and or control over the systems and institutions of a society. Okay, let's keep that in mind when we're talking about power, because sometimes we think there are different types of power, and there are different levels of power, and there are individuals of color, and there are Black Americans who have certain kinds of power, but they do not have power over institutions. If you look at an institution, for example, such as the Congress, the Senate of the United States, well, how many Black Americans are senators in this society? Who knows? One, today. One, right? But we are representative as what percentage of the society? 11 to 12%. And if you look at CEOs of companies and all of these institutions that are in place, hierarchies in education, CEOs of major corporations, speaking to a continuum